Hi again. This is Aslam Kakar. Today I wanted to talk to you about oppression. We hear this term, oppression. We hear also oppressed. What do we mean by it? And I want to make sense of it in comparative contexts, but also particularly in the case of Pakistan. Um, One problem with defining or understanding or making sense of the term is that people use it very loosely to describe many different situations. The problem, although one could argue that um, terms, words are elastic and one can use them, extend them to describe and include different phenomena. But the problem with extending or with the elasticity of words and terms is that when we extend them too much, we break them. They stop making sense that we want them to make, right? That's one problem with the elasticity of concepts and ideas, but it also has its uses. So, in the um, context of oppression, that happens in, for example, many places in Pakistan. When the Baloch say we are oppressed, others say from more prosperous and stable and um, privileged places and groups, they also say we are oppressed. We are, so everybody starts to use start to use the the term oppression or oppressed. Now, let me and that happens in the United States also. When people say not in exactly um, in terms of using the word oppression, but when black people say police brutality is so common against black males and black people, then in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, there were these slogans which said blue lives matter, as in cops lives matter, and all of those things, right? Or in Pakistan, when Pashtuns say we have suffered in war on terror, then there are statements such as all Pakistanis have suffered, right? Um, Slightly different, but the idea is that when one group of people claim that there is that they've experienced oppression or they experience oppression routinely, others then claim they experience the same, and that just sort of you know takes the air out of the thing itself, right? It doesn't make sense. Like, then what do we mean by it? Who are the oppressed? Now, to define the term oppression, I would like to use the definition by an American philosopher, political philosopher, Marilyn Frye. She wrote a book, Oppression. I think it's called Oppression. In the book, she first does what she does is that she gets to the root word of oppression, which is press. Now, when we say press, what we mean by it is that we that we, for example, I press this cup, or if it's another material or another object such as a bag or a bag full of liquid or gas. If I press it, I mean by pressing that I use force. I mold it, or I reduce it, or I immobilize it. So, by the way, root um, word or press, Marilyn Frye says that when things are pressed, things are molded, things are flattened, things are immobilized, things are reduced, right? When people are pressed, they are immobilized, they are reduced, they are, um, um, what was the third one? Um, they are molded in or by structures, right? And from which it is very difficult for them to free themselves. And now, this definition of oppression is something very different from the way we use it usually, right? We just use it loosely to refer to all kinds of scenarios. Um, to understand this in a much more richer detail, I would highly encourage you to read the book. But the essence of the argument is that oppression means immobilizing, molding, and reducing people in ways from which it is very difficult for them to free themselves, right? And when I think of oppression in this sense, I think of the Baloch in the ways in which the Pakistani state has molded the circumstances, immobilized them, reduced them in their life in ways from which it is very difficult for them to free themselves and to live in their on their own terms, right? So there is a systematic, um, oppressive um, structure, a place or in place that, at the risk of repeating these terms, so you also remember, that immobilize their movement or their way of being, that molds them. That, I mean, by molds, as in, I don't mean it to say that the Baloch are manipulated, but by molding, by creating circumstances and structures and policies and so on, which um, reduce these people, right? Now, that is very different from what happens in other parts of the country, right? I mean, the Pashtuns have felt the same phenomenon in the north, um, particularly in Khyber, in the tribal areas, which gave rise to PTM. But also, we are seeing another wave of insurgency and militant insurgency and violence, and that is, again, it's a form of oppression, and I'll get into the details a little in a moment. Um, so this is the sort of the broad sense in which, the broad, as in, it's there's not enough time to give all the details in the different ways in which, uh, the examples and so on, as I in the book, that Frye sort of develops this and substantiates this further. But I will um, go into the work of another theorist, political theorist, Iris Marion Young, again an American feminist political theorist, who developed this idea of oppression further into an article that she wrote, titled as, five the five faces of oppression, or five faces of oppression, which include marginalization, exploitation, um, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence. Now, Young's typology is um, a developed sort of version of what Frye said, and what, and I will very quickly go into each one of these, right? Five faces of oppression. Now, marginalization, right? When what it means is that when people become marginals, such as old people who don't, in the United States, for example, a lot of old people don't have jobs; they become marginals. Well, marginals also mean, I mean, people, young people, or people from particular communities who um, have no means or resources because of the way the structure and the system works or is in place, that they become marginals, in that, in the sense that they don't participate in the social and the political, they don't get to participate in the social and the political and so on, spheres of life, right? So they are reduced, or they are thrown to the fringes of the society. And now marginalization, if you think about it, it happens to not just to one group. I mean, I'll just talk about in the context of Pakistan. I mean, there is marginalization in Punjab, there is marginalization in other places, right, in Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and so on. But marginalization, even there, um, is, in some places it is so much more than in other places, right? So Kila Abdullah, for example, is one of the poorest districts of the in the country, right? So even here, I will argue that Baloch and Pashtuns from many areas are systematically marginalized, right? I mean, yes, there are many who get to participate, but there are a lot of them who don't. Now, marginalization also happens. I mean, in Punjab, we have seen. I mean, poverty and it's not that it doesn't exist there, right? So you can say if those who are marginals or those who are marginalized, they are oppressed, right? Because they are reduced and immobilized and um, um, they're molded by the system. Now, exploitation, it takes place in most parts of the country, but in some places more, right, than in others, right? I mean, exploitation goes beyond class. It's regional to how the Baloch feel. Their land is exploited and their resources are exploited. So that there is oppression in that context. Now, you could also see exploitation of the poor in Punjab, but in sort of a comparative sense, across these regions, some regions are more exploited and are given little to nothing in return, right? There is that. Then there is powerlessness. Now, powerlessness is a very, I don't necessarily like, it's a very interesting and powerful term. And I don't necessarily like Frye's definition of powerlessness, where she really, if I can recall it correctly, she uses it in the context of the professional class and the non-professional class, and the professional class feeling like they have no power over, you know, things in society. And we are seeing a little bit of that in the American context, where you can actually see the rise of Trump and his movement. I mean, these are millionaires and billionaires and filthy rich elites, but there is that anger and anti-intellectualism or anti-expertise of sorts, right? So these people, this current or this movement against expertise and the professional class or the technocrats and so on. So there is that divide, and we're seeing it unfolding in really dangerous ways. But I it makes sense to me, right? But I sort of extend this definition of powerlessness, and link it to power, right? So here, power becomes central to the definition or the understanding of oppression, right? So who first of all, what is power? Who has power over whom? And if we understand that, then we also get or gain clarity on the meaning of oppression. So power for me, I mean, it's a long, I can do another video another day on power, but power for me is um, the ability, right, um, of a group or individual or of a people over others, so that the powerful can coerce the weak and the powerless into doing things that they don't want to do, or prevent them from doing things that they want to do, right? So that is very broadly defined power. But power is also, as um, a fascinating book, Power, a Radical View, that I use in some of my research, by Stephen Lukes, um, is defined as a three-dimensional phenomenon. Power is that we is that which we see used by states in terms of um, you know observable things such as the use of force against population. But power is also a non-decision making power. So the first is the decision making phenomenon. The second is the non-decision making phenomenon, in the sense that power is at play when issues, um, or when decisions are being made as to what grievances deserve to be called issues, right? So, like, is the Baloch grievance an issue, or should we just set it aside and move on, right? I mean, that's what we are seeing, right? Who is writing about whom? Who is getting invited on the screen and on the in TV channels and shows, and what issues are discussed, what issues are silenced, what is being talked about, what is not being talked about, or what is being left out is as important as what is being included or being talked about, right? So power is that too. And then power is ideological power, right? Which really shapes the cognition, the emotions, and the very um, um, the very psychosocial and emotional um, life of individuals, um, in terms of how they relate to the world and how they understand the the context in which they live, and so on, and that is also at play. So powerlessness is for me really can be understood by sort of um, embedding it in in the definition, or with the definition of power itself. What is power, right? So we see and we know how power works, and who has power in Pakistan, and who is it used against, and who are the powerless. And so the powerless are the oppressed here. Then we have cultural imperialism, of course. Whose culture is being ridiculed? Who is being seen as regressive and provincial? And for example, in Punjab, where I've lived where I lived for 6 years, and to this day, I mean, you see it on talk shows, how Pashtuns are being ridiculed. And again, I mean, I'm not saying Pashtuns are somehow saintly creatures, or the Baloch are saintly creatures, but the problem is that the level playing field is not the same. There is no level playing field for these groups, right? So when you don't own, or when you don't have the means and the resources to, now with social media, things have changed, right? There is a lot that we can do, but historically and for the most part, these people have been reduced to like, um, you know, the slaves of these khans and maliks and sardars and so on, which very much is along the lines of what the British did. Um, this whole Orientalist scholarship about the Orient, right? So, for example, the British, um, about Afghanistan and the Afghan leaders, they um, painted all of them just because of the policies or the behavior of Amir Abdurrahman Khan as um, you know regressive and violent and so on. So these are tropes, right? That we have Orientalist tropes that we see being played out again and again in Pakistan. I mean, there are these colonial continuities, right, in this post-colonial context where the periphery and their um, the culture of the periphery and the politics of the periphery and the nationalism of the periphery has been painted with um, these or presented by using these kinds of stereotypes and tropes. So there is cultural imperialism at play, right? And not to mention, um, I mean, that would be for another day, uh, but there is this undermining of the representation, the actual representation of who these people are and what they want and why they deserve this and so on. And then lastly, there is violence, and violence we know as the fifth phase of oppression. I mean, Pakistani state is a violent state. It has used violence against a lot of people, but in some regions, such as Balochistan and the tribal areas and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and state violence, and violence by non-state actors under the nose of the state, while the state looks the other way, has been routine. Whereas in Punjab, it has been an exception, right? We have seen it, it's used, but it's nowhere compared to how violence is used in the periphery. So, five phases of oppression, right? Marginalization, exploitation, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence. By defining each one of them, I am making the case that in Pakistan, oppression, when we use the word oppression, we really have to be careful in what we mean by it and who are the oppressed. And for me, yes, there is poverty. Yes, there is exploitation. Yes, there is marginalization across the country, right? It is a violent state. But some regions and some groups are at the receiving end of violence, at the receiving end of exploitation, at the receiving end of cultural imperialism and marginalization and uh, powerlessness, especially. And so the next time you I hope when you use the word oppression and oppressed, I hope you're careful in using what you mean by it. And I hope um, you will remember that we have to use words and terms responsibly and um, with humility and honesty, epistemic honesty and intellectual humility, and not lump all kinds of things um, under it or into it and just um, erase. I mean, and what that does is that it undermines it erases the importance of the the very discourse of oppression, right? Because then it doesn't mean anything. When you want it to make when you want it to mean everything, then it starts to lose its very essence. And so, well, again, not to repeat myself. Uh, I hope this is. I don't know if you have come across this before or not, but I hope you will. It will give you some food for thought as to what we mean by oppression and oppressed in comparative context, but especially in Pakistan. Thanks so much. I hope you will like the video and share it. Have a good evening, and I'll see you again. Bye.